class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing possible trades for the Sharks' second overall pick. This is the third straight year where they will be picking in the top four, but 2 years ago it would have been crazy to think that the Sharks would trade away the fourth overall pick, and last year it was absolutely unimaginable that they would move on from the first overall pick. This is the first season where you can see a potential pathway to the Sharks trading their first rounder. I'm not saying it will happen. In fact, the most likely scenario is that the Sharks get to the draft, make a selection at number 2, no matter who that ends up being, and that's that. But I do believe that there is a non-zero chance that if the correct deal comes across Mike Greer's table, he may not hesitate to actually pull the trigger. As such, it's a fun thought experiment to think about what could perhaps a deal of this nature, a trade of this nature, actually end up looking like. But there are a few very important caveats to discuss before we actually get into the bulk of this video. The first of which is that trades are extremely subjective and depend on how each individual value these players and assets. The one piece that is moving in every single one of these trades is the second overall pick. That is presumed to be Michael Misa, and so you will value each of these trades depending on how you actually view Misa as a prospect. If you believe that he is the potential future superstar here in the NHL, capable of putting up over 100 points per season, all of these are absolute ripoffs that the Sharks should never even in a million years consider making. On the other hand, if you view Misa in a slightly lower esteem, perhaps these trades will appear more fair, or perhaps even lopsided in favor of the San Jose Sharks. Not everybody is going to agree on everything, and I didn't want that to ruin what could be a fun video in general. The next caveat is that you'll notice most trades in the NHL don't just involve a couple of major pieces, but a lot of the more minor pieces as well that kind of balance out the trade, whether that be these draft picks in the 4th and 5th round, or some minor level players, or some C-level prospects, things like that. And I have not included any of those types of assets in any of these trades. I don't feel as though that's really important to talk about. It is possible some of them require the other team to add a 3rd rounder, or the Sharks to add a 2nd rounder to get it done. I wanted to discuss the actual major important assets of these trades that if they were to happen, that's really what the conversation would be about, not that the Sharks gave up an extra 5th round pick or anything like that. And then the third important caveat is that it is quite clear that when you have the 2nd overall pick, every single team in the NHL would absolutely love to pick that up for their organization. There are 31 teams that would be interested in making a deal happen here with the Sharks. And one of the easiest trades to make in these types of scenarios is to just simply trade down, move down a few spots, and give that team the 2nd overall pick. And I could have easily discussed a trade down to 7, and then 8, and then 9, and then 10, and 11, and then so on and so forth. But all of those trades would end up being extremely similar, very similar type of structure. Not all that interesting. Instead, I wanted to try and come up with a few trades that have the same type of core to them, because at the end of the day, the Sharks are not making this deal if they don't end up getting the very important asset that they are after, which is a young defenseman who has played at the very least a year, maybe a couple of years in the NHL, who has the floor of being at the very least a top 4 defenseman, but the potential of reaching a top pairing level. That's what the Sharks want to get. All of these trades need to have that, but the other major details of such a deal, that could be different, and that's really what I wanted to focus on, the wider range that they could end up making, even if a trade down might be the most likely scenario available here. Now we get to the first trade that I have with the Buffalo Sabres, the Sharks sending the 2nd overall pick to Buffalo in exchange for the 9th overall pick, as well as defenseman Owen Power. And I think a very important part to focus on when it comes to these deals is not just why the Sharks would make the trade, but why the Buffalo Sabres would be willing to make it as well. This is not a video game. It's not a situation where if you just put up the correct amount of value, the trade will get easily done. Other teams also have motivations, also have needs and wants, and you have to try and match those. For instance, if a team were to come up to the Sharks and offer a really good forward prospect in exchange for Sam Dickinson, the Sharks wouldn't make that deal. Even if it seemed to be equivalent in value, the Sharks really need a defensive player. There are no place to be trading away Dickinson, so that's the deal that would kind of fall apart. So why is this one that Buffalo would end up making? Well, as we know, the Sabres as a franchise has been kind of lost for a while now. I believe this is 14 straight years in which they have missed the playoffs. They've gone through a rebuild. They've gone through a second rebuild. They've had multiple first overall picks. They've had a second overall pick. They've had great players come and go through the organization and then go on to do bigger and better things with other teams, like Jack Eichel moving on to win a Stanley Cup with the Vegas Golden Knights, or Sam Reinhart moving on to win a Stanley Cup with the Florida Panthers. And yet the Buffalo Sabres have remained stagnant, not being able to really ever get into the postseason. And so they would want to really be able to make some sort of change here. It's easy to just throw in the towel and give up, but after 14 years, you gotta keep it going. And so they would want to make a change, but at the same time, it's difficult when the Buffalo team is just not a really attractive landing option for a lot of the top flight free agents. This is not the first place that a lot of players actually want to sign in because of the past decade plus that they have had. And so the Sabres, if they really want to add game-changing talent, they have to do it either through a trade or through the draft, which is what presents to them in this deal. On top of that, one of the major things that the Sabres actually do have going for them is a glut of young, talented left-handed defensemen. Currently, they have Rasmus Dahlin, Owen Power, and Bowen Byram within the organization. Dahlin is very clearly the number one. In fact, I believe Dahlin to be one of the best defensemen in the entire NHL, really only slightly overlooked because of the fact that he does play in Buffalo, so he's their clear-cut number one guy. You don't also need two other players here in that same exact position. And so one of them, one of Power or Byram, is definitely somewhat movable if it will really help the Buffalo Sabres improve. Technically, Byram is interchangeable here with Owen Power. I personally like Owen Power a little bit more, so that's why I included him in this trade, but obviously it would ultimately come down to Greer and who he values more in this type of deal. But for the sake of this video, I will be discussing Owen Power. Now, if he does get moved, what would the Sabres be looking for? Well, at the forward side of things, they've got an elite talent in Tage Thompson, a player who is capable of scoring 40, maybe even 50 goals in the NHL, 90 plus points. And then they have some other good to maybe even really good forwards, Alex Tuck, JJ Peterka, the recently acquired Josh Norris from the Ottawa Senators. But what they might really, really want is another elite talent that could potentially match what Tage Thompson is capable of. Well, the second overall pick is where you could find that type of player. If indeed they decide to pick Michael Misa, he might be able to help in that type of top line position and in the somewhat immediate future. Maybe not this next year right out of the gate, but in a couple of years' time, he can make that type of impact. So this could be a really interesting pickup for Buffalo because they wouldn't be able to grab this type of player most likely at number 9. And so with Power, it would be selling kind of low on him at this point, but you have to pay a price if you want to move up. 7 spots might not seem like a lot here, going from 9th to 2nd, and indeed 7 spots in like the 5th round isn't a big deal, but within the top 10 and specifically in a top heavy draft to get to that number 2 spot, that's going to cost you, and the Buffalo Sabres might be willing to pay that price. Now, what are the Sharks actually getting out of this deal? Well, Owen Power is a young, talented defenseman. He fits the bill of what the Sharks are looking for. He's got maybe a little bit more NHL experience than the Sharks would be expecting, but that's mostly because he was that first overall guy, so he made his NHL debut relatively early. He was actually in the draft that saw William Eklund get taken by the Sharks, so that puts his age into perspective. He has a lot of offensive talent. He has the ability to contribute. It's not like an insane amount. Maybe he's not a 90-point defenseman, but he would immediately jump into being the Sharks' number 1 guy, even that's not really saying all that much. His defensive game could absolutely use some work, but it's kind of hard to fully evaluate him as a player because, as we know, he was with Buffalo. That organization has been extremely up and down for the few years that he's been with them. So how much of that is having an impact on his game? It's the same as if you're trying to evaluate a defenseman with the Sharks. The Sharks as a whole are so bad that a lot of the defensemen are going to end up looking worse than they really are. And so it's a kind of a work in progress here on the defensive side for Power. And important to remember, he's still rather young. Defensemen take a little bit longer to develop. And the big thing is that he does have that first overall pick pedigree. This was a player who teams and scouts felt as though had the tools, had the potential, had the skill and talent level to reach the value of what you would expect from a first overall talent. He can still get there. He's not over the hill. He's not like 30 years old or anything like that. Still very, very young. He can still get to that point. There are a couple of aspects here of this player that might bring Mike Grier a little bit more pause, but at the same time, maybe it's actually could be spun into a positive. The first of which is that Owen Power is not on his entry-level contract anymore. He's actually signed a pretty major extension with the Sabres. He's making over $8 million this year and then for the next 6 seasons. So we have seen Mike Grier be hesitant about giving away long-term contracts to free agents and things like that. He would likely still be hesitant to also pick up these types of deal, but at a point you do have to give mega extensions to your top talented players. Owen Power would end up being one of those guys, and while he might not be worth the $8+ million he's making right at this moment, especially with the cap going up into the future, and if he can kind of scale up his game a little bit within the next couple of years, this could end up being a bit of a steal, and maybe it's best that he's already under this type of contract. The other thing is one of the big reasons for why Owen Power went first overall in the first place is that he does have a ton of size, and as they say, you cannot teach size. He's, I believe, 6'6", well over 200 pounds. One would think he is this incredibly physically imposing player on the ice, but Owen Power really kind of isn't. He's not someone who's going to lay the body. He's not someone who's going to be extremely physical. When you take a look at the 230 defensemen who have played at least 30 games this regular season, Owen Power has the 19th lowest hits per 60 minutes. That is the bottom 10% of this particular category, and that might not look particularly good on him. It's not a great reflection of him, but since he is 19th last, there are 18 players below him, which includes Quinn Hughes, which includes Zach Werenski, Chris Tanev, Jacob Slavin, Ryan McDonough, really elite players on both sides of the puck, which goes to show that, yes, that physicality, that ability to actually just hit the player and knock them off the puck is really important, but if you can offer a really elite level of offense or a really elite level of defense in terms of your defensive positioning and your defensive awareness, you can kind of get away with not having to be overly physical. If you remember a decade ago when Marc-Edouard Vlasic was dominating the NHL as one of, if not the best defensive defenseman, he as well really wasn't all that physical. He might throw a hit here or there, but he was usually in the bottom half, the bottom quarter in this particular stat in the entire NHL. You can be smart and get around having to do this. But at the same time, I mentioned you can't teach size. Well, you can teach a player how to use that size, and while it's been more of a slow go in Buffalo, maybe the Sharks could get him to move more so in that direction. So generally, this is a player with a ton of potential. At worst, you're getting a really solid second pairing guy, and he might even be able to develop up into a first pairing. The real only downside truly here is that he is a left-handed defenseman, so it's not a perfect fit for what the Sharks would be looking for, which is obviously someone who can play the right side, but it could still work out. And then the other asset here is this 9th overall pick, what the Sharks would be trading down to pick. The big thing about this is that it can end up being used to pick a fan favorite, I guess you could say, draft prospect, Victor Eklund. I've had many questions, and I've seen many questions online about how could the Sharks end up drafting Eklund, because it would be a massive reach at number 2, and it would be close to impossible to actually get him with the Dallas pick. And so a lot of people theorizing how the Sharks could perhaps make a package to move up in the draft to get into the top 10 so that they have a chance of picking this player. Well, if they move down to number 2, or to number 9, it would certainly be possible, and having that combination of Victor Eklund with his brother William Eklund, it would certainly be quite cool, and Eklund can provide a lot of value, hardworking, extremely competitive, just like his brother, the type of player that maybe Grier wouldn't like on the surface here because he's a bit of a smaller bodied winger, but the type of competitiveness that he would absolutely learn to love, just as he has done with his brother William Eklund, that would be an interesting selection. So a trade here that the Sharks maybe would be willing to make. The next deal is with the Los Angeles Kings, the Sharks sending the 2nd overall pick to them in exchange for defenseman Brandt Clarke. Liam Greentree, as well as the first round pick in 2026. Now, from a Los Angeles Kings perspective, why would they make this deal? Well, LA is kind of in a bit of a weird situation. Obviously, they're not as badly off as the Sabres are, where they have missed the playoffs for many, many years. But Los Angeles, they had previously, a few years ago, gone through a bit of a mini rebuild where they were able to pick up a couple of highly touted, high-level draft prospects. Quinton Byfield at number 2 overall. I think he's a really good player, but he isn't an elite star in the NHL at this point. And then Alex Turcotte at number 5 overall. He hasn't quite panned out as hoped for. Some injuries that have kind of got in the way of it. And then quickly after making a couple of these choices, the Kings immediately brought it back to making it into the playoffs. But their issue here is that they have constantly run into the brick wall known as the Edmonton Oilers. 4 straight seasons now, which they have lost to the Edmonton Oilers in the first round. And occasionally it was expected for that to happen, but in particular this year, the Kings looked like it would be the time for them to really beat their demons. They had a fantastic regular season. Everything was going in their favor. They won the first 2 games of the series, but then when it really got down to it, the star power that the Oilers can offer up is just too much for the Kings' more defensive system. They don't necessarily have that type of game breaker player who can really just put the team on his back and win a game single-handedly like the Oilers have with both Draisaitl and Connor McDavid. So once again, the Kings fell short. And the problem here is that this is a team that is way too good to actually miss the playoffs and actually fall into the position where they could draft a potential star player like this. But they are clearly not good enough to at the very least be able to even just beat the Edmonton Oilers, who are likely to have to face multiple times here just to get out of the Pacific Division. So if the Kings actually want this type of star player, sure, they could explore free agency. Maybe they'll try to be in on Mitch Marner, but there's no guarantees that something like that could happen. And it's not as though Mitch Marner is necessarily a game breaker in the playoffs. If for those of you who may have watched last night's Game 7 with the Maple Leafs and the Florida Panthers, if they're not going to be able to add this star player through free agency, well, the draft is a possibility if they are to make this trade. Michael Misa, again, it kind of depends on how you view him as a player, but if they believe he can be that true game breaker, it would be a very interesting ad, and they would be willing to give up assets to do so. Liam Greentree and a first-round pick, these are future pieces that the Kings really wouldn't be too worried about. Brandt Clarke is likely more of a big kind of stopgap of this deal. This would maybe bring the Kings more pause, but you do have to spend money to make money, and Clarke was someone who didn't even play in a significant role for the Los Angeles Kings through this year's playoffs, so they are very clearly trying to get him to be the new Drew Doughty, but they're not letting that happen until Doughty is actually gone here, so it is possible that they will view him as slightly expendable, and again, you gotta give up strong assets if you want to be able to get that type of star player. When it comes from a Sharks perspective, what they would be getting out of Brandt Clarke is a player who I really, really enjoy. I'm sure you could probably know that because every single time I discuss the possibility of the Sharks getting a young defenseman, the example I always use is Brandt Clarke because he is just very, very impressive. Every single time I watch him, I really, really like what I see. And since the Sharks play the Kings rather often, it does happen quite a lot. He is someone who, like with Owen Power, would jump into immediately being the Sharks' number 1, at least in the short term, which would be a very different scenario for him. Unlike Power, who has played many 20-plus minute nights for the Buffalo Sabres, Clarke has been more so in a limited role with the Kings. Throughout this season, there have been moments where he's had less than 10 minutes of ice time. He's occasionally been a healthy scratch, which is the reason for why he has appeared in trade rumors in the first place. And as I said, in the playoffs this season, he was viewed as more of a 5th guy. The Los Angeles Kings coach decided to use their top 4 of Edmondson, Doughty, Anderson, and Gavrikov very, very heavily, relying on them. Clarke kind of got pushed to the wayside because of that, so he hasn't fully handled this type of huge role, but I think he has that capability. He is someone who is somewhat established here in the NHL because he has played a season, so he fits into what the Sharks are looking for. He can be a future power play quarterback. He's got an absolute exceptional offensive awareness. He moves pretty well as well, and unlike Owen Power, he is also a right-handed defenseman, so in 2-3 years time you can envision a top pairing of Sam Dickinson and Brandt Clarke. That would look really, really great. Defensively, as with a lot of young defensemen, it's a slight work in progress, but besides the fact that he was kind of held back a little bit from really being a star defenseman in Los Angeles, he did also get the benefit from the fact that the Kings do play a hyper-defensive system. Clark gets to learn that type of defense from one of the best defensemen of the last 20 years, Drew Doughty. So it's a work in progress that maybe he has a kind of leg up in that type of race. So to me, I feel as though Brandt Clark would be an absolute slam dunk for the Sharks to acquire. But there also needs to be more value in this trade for a second overall pick. That's where Liam Greentree comes in. The Los Angeles Kings did once have an extremely impressive prospect pool, but because they have moved into being more competitive for these last few seasons, despite always losing in the first round, that prospect pool has thinned out. Their top guy is probably Greentree, who was their first rounder this past season, I believe 26th overall, if I'm not mistaken, something along those lines. Greentree as a player does have some pretty good potential. He is sort of reminiscent of a player like Porter Martone in this year's draft. Not quite the same level of elite talent, but he fits the bill of being that power forward, good size winger that could play up in the lineup, strong shot, good player who just knows how to put the puck in the net. Not the greatest skating, not the greatest defensively, so he has weaknesses that kind of hold him back here, but would be a very interesting add who is not too far away of playing in the NHL. Probably wouldn't happen this next season, but maybe in a couple of years. And then a first round pick. You could theoretically try to pick up the first round pick in 2025 from the Kings. I believe that'll be like 23rd or 24th overall, maybe 25th, something along those lines. But a late first in this year's draft is not expected to be very high value. And even if the Sharks do have a player in the latter parts of the first round that they are interested in trying to draft, they still have the Dallas first rounder that will probably be at around 30, depending on how they finish up in the playoffs this year. So they would probably be able to grab that player. Getting a 2026 first not only opens up the opportunity of the Kings completely collapsing and you end up getting a really good draft, but also just because 2026 is expected to be better than 2025, that's why I've gone in that direction here. It kind of does come down to how you really view Liam Greentree, I would say, as a prospect. If this is someone who Mike Grier really does like and can see as a future second liner with this organization, well, the value of the trade is likely more fair. If they don't view him that highly, if they don't think he's necessarily got that potential to be a strong top 6 guy in the NHL, well, maybe this is a deal that can't happen. But again, I didn't want to just have a bunch of trade down deals. This is at least a bit more interesting and is a pathway to get Brandt Clark, who again, I'm a big fan of. And then we have a deal with the Detroit Red Wings, another one that is slightly different because it doesn't involve the Sharks actually getting any draft picks back, just 2 established players here. The Sharks moving on from the second overall pick to Detroit for defenseman Simon Edvinsson, as well as forward Marco Kasper. And we'll start off from the Detroit perspective. This one is going to be a little bit more difficult to shake because I imagine the Red Wings might not want to move away from one of their young defensemen. Obviously, their top guy is Moritz Seider, and then they have Axel Sandin Pellikka, who is coming up through the system, perhaps a player who the Sharks could also want to target in such a deal, but Edvinsson being that lefty, which doesn't really work well for the Sharks here, but does work well for the Red Wings because both Sandin Pellikka and Seider are righties. It's a situation where they might want to hold on to this player, but just as I said with Brandt Clark, you do have to spend money to make money. The Red Wings, they would really like to pick up a star player because they had missed the playoffs for many years now in a row. We're probably going on about a decade at this point after such many, many years of dominance for this Red Wings organization. But the problem here is that during this time, the Red Wings have had terrible lottery luck. Even in years where they have finished right near or at the bottom of the standings, they always seem to lose out. So they have yet to actually pick in the top 3 of the draft in any of this past few years of losing. Their highest pick was Lucas Raymond at 4th overall, and this one did work out exceptionally well for them. Lucas Raymond, I would consider, he's kind of like bordering on elite at this point, but the thing is that past that point, Kind of like with the Buffalo Sabres, do they have another elite talent to go with him? Not quite. DeBrincat is kind of close and maybe still has the potential to reach that. And then you have a player like Dylan Larkin, who has been a long-time Detroit Red Wings. He's definitely also bordering on that level, but maybe you would want to add another game breaker here at forward, and you're not going to be realistically able to do that unless you are able to sign Mitch Marner or you are going to be going through the draft. And so this second overall pick does present the possibility of adding that type of player, even if it does cost moving on from one of your young, talented defensemen. Now, when it comes to Simon Edvinsson for the San Jose Sharks, he is kind of a similar player in a way to Owen Power. Doesn't have that same level of draft pedigree because he's not a first overall pick, but he was still pretty high up, a 6th overall pick again in the William Eklund draft. It's interesting because all 3 of these defensemen I'm considering were all taken in 2021. Edvinsson was the 6th overall pick of the Detroit Red Wings, but he has the same type of size that Power has. He's also 6'6", big defenseman, but he's more willing to use that size, doubled up, tripled up on the amount of hits that Owen Power actually had this season in less ice time. He is, and this is like his first year in the NHL, or his first full season, I should say, in the NHL, so he's kind of adjusting to that physicality compared to Owen Power, who has played like 3 full years already in the big leagues. And so Edvinsson does project out as more of a physical guy. His offensive game, kind of like with Power, you might not be expecting 80 or 90 points, but he's a player who can jump into the rush. He can contribute 50, maybe 60 points, is very possible for him in the future. He moves very well, can be quite solid defensively, had a great year, honestly, with Detroit, despite them being more of a middling team. He played about a third of his time with Moritz Seider on the Red Wings top pairing, where he looked very, very good. Obviously, it helps playing with Seider, who is a great defenseman, but 2/3 of his season, he wasn't playing with that top guy and still managed to perform quite well. And so that pans out very well for the Sharks wanting to pick him up. He would, again, immediately jump up into being the Sharks' #1 defenseman, at least for the foreseeable future, until maybe Sam Dickinson challenges him for that spot. Despite the fact that he is a left-handed defenseman, he would be a really interesting add for this team. Then, when it comes to Marco Kasper, this has the possibility of adding an established forward to the roster. Kasper has the ability to play center, and he's quite good at it. Came close to 40 points this season, close to 20 goals. It was his rookie year in the NHL. He'll probably finish around like maybe 5th or 6th in Calder voting, depending on how things actually work out for him. But he fits the bill of a Mike Greer guy. He has not a tremendous amount of size. He's not 6'6" like Edvinsson or Owen Power, but he's 6'1", 6'2", that type of range, but he plays an extremely physical game. Despite it being his rookie year, he had over 150 hits while being someone who can contribute offensively. If you put that in comparison to the Sharks roster this year, sure, it's behind guys like Dellandrea and Grundstrom, bottom 6 guys who you expect to just kind of throw the body around, but compared to some of the more skilled players on the Sharks, it is far and away the best. And so he could not only make up an exceptionally deep center depth with, let's say, Celebrini, Smith, and Kasper as your third C going into the future, something that, let's say, the Tampa Bay Lightning have benefited from during their elite years as the best team in the NHL when they had Stamkos, Point, and Cirelli as their 3 centers. Kasper also has shown the ability to play on the wing this season when he was up on the top line with Lucas Raymond and Dylan Larkin. Benefits very, very well from being able to do that. Adds that physical element. You play him with Smith, you play him with Celebrini. While I won't say he's going to protect those players, he will be that type of physical asset there. This is someone who is capable of putting up 50 plus points in the NHL, 60 plus points. The sky's the limit here, already putting up a solid rookie season. So he maybe isn't that full-on game breaker, which is the reason why Detroit would look to move up to number 2 to try and draft that type of player, but a very interesting add nonetheless, who fits into the Greer mold and plays a premium position at center. The final trade to discuss here is with the New York Islanders, and unlike every single one of the previous deals where it involves the Sharks not picking that high in this year's draft, this is the one deal that has the Sharks moving the other way, a trade up to try and grab the first overall pick. And you'll notice that I haven't tried to outline any sort of details of what this trade would actually look like because it is so absolutely difficult to nail down. It is extremely rare that the first overall pick actually does get traded, and it is hard to know exactly what the Islanders are thinking because at the moment they don't actually have a general manager. They had fired him at the end of the season, and even despite winning this first overall pick, they have yet to hire a new guy to take over. Now, previously, I would imagine the Islanders would like to stay competitive, but as we know from past experience, a new general manager can completely change the direction of the franchise. The Sharks went from re-signing Tomas Hertl to an 8-year deal to then trading away everything that wasn't bolted down just a few months later when they hired Mike Grier. So it's hard to know exactly what the Islanders are going to do. At the moment, the consensus choice for number 1 is likely to be Matthew Schaefer, but it is not nearly as agreed upon as it was the previous season with Celebrini and the year before that with Connor Bedard, which is why this is the possibility of a trade occurring. But if the Islanders are truly looking for that full reset type of rebuild and they just want to pick the best player available, they will likely go for Matthew Schaefer. But there is a possibility. I won't get into the details of what the Islanders situation actually is. That's the purpose for a different video. But there is a situation where they could absolutely look into drafting a forward. That would probably be Michael Misa. And since they are about 99.9% convinced that if given the chance, the Sharks would grab Schaefer instead, it is theoretically within the Islanders' best interest, if they are planning to take a forward, to actually make this pick swap with the Sharks, because they could just pick up some free assets anyway and still get the guy that they want, which will spawn some level of a game of chicken between the Islanders management group and the Sharks management group, because it will be up to the Islanders to try to convince San Jose that they want Matthew Schaefer, but that they're willing to make a deal happen for the right price, and it'll be the Sharks' job to try and read the Islanders group and see if whether or not they're saying is actually true and that they would take Schaefer at number 1, or if they believe that the Islanders are going to be taking Misa. As such, I would say that the type of value that could be exchanged here would vary very, very greatly. There's a possibility where the Sharks have to add in the Dallas first rounder and the Oilers first rounder and a couple of prospects just to try and make that happen. For instance, if you take a look at last season, had the Chicago Blackhawks really truly approached San Jose and said, hey, let's make a pick 1 to 2 swap to try and get Celebrini for themselves, the Sharks would request Sam Rinzel and Frank Nazar and an unprotected first round pick and then a second unprotected first round pick. It would be so extreme that the price would be way too high for Chicago to ever really consider. That's the type of situation that could theoretically occur here with Matthew Schaefer, but if it is clear that the Islanders want to grab a forward, want to grab Misa, maybe the Sharks will come up and say, hey, we'll just give you our second round pick, the 33rd overall pick, to make this swap happen. The point being here is that, like with many of these other trades, I don't think it is very likely to occur, but there is a possibility if indeed something could actually get settled here. I don't think it will. I think both teams will play their hand very close to their chest, and as such, it's not going to get done. But crucially, it is important to mention that for all of the 3 other trades that I mentioned with Buffalo, Los Angeles, and Detroit, none of these I expect to actually get done until the draft actually arrives, because I think the Sharks will be holding out hope that they will be able to grab Matthew Schaefer at number 2, and so they will wait, most likely, to the last possible minute to see what the Islanders do at number 1. They could kind of get these trades into position, ready to pull the trigger if that situation does occur. But if the Islanders grab Misa, there is no chance the Sharks trade their second overall pick. They will grab Schaefer no matter what, because that's who they would want in the first place. The only way these deals happen is if the Islanders do take Schaefer and then the Sharks get something done while they are on the clock for that number 2 selection. But that will do it for this video. These are the trades that I could potentially see happening. Like I said, very, very subjective approach. I know there's going to be a bunch of people who say these trades are absolutely absurd. The Sharks or the Buffalo Sabres or the Kings or the Detroit Red Wings would never actually make these deals. But it's fun to spawn some discussion here. And I think, these would not be the end of the world type of trades for the Sharks to make. Class dismissed.